Alexandra, this story is full of twists and turns. So for those who haven't closely followed the coverage, walk us through what happened.
Absolutely. So essentially, in the fall of 2021, Rogers is in this unique situation. The CEO of Rogers at the time is a man named Joe Natale, and he's come from TELUS. He's been in the role for a few years now. He's, led the company through this uncertain period of the pandemic, and he's just signed a huge deal, the $20 billion takeover of Shaw Communications Inc. This is the deal of Rogers founder Ted Rogers' dreams. Ted had always wanted to be a truly national cable company. So Joe thinks that things are going pretty well. And then essentially what happens is the matter of some dispute, but according to Joe's side and the side from people in his camp, is that Joe makes a phone call to his chief financial officer or CFO, Tony Staffieri, and Tony inadvertently answers the call while he is sitting with a friend and discussing how he plans to remake the leadership ranks of Rogers Communications when he imminently becomes the CEO of Rogers. And so Joe allegedly overhears this and he's shocked and stunned because, of course, he thought things were going pretty well. And he brings this matter to Chairman Edward Rogers. I should note that the other side of this conflict actually argues that there was no inadvertent phone call or butt dial or butt answer, as it's been described in various ways, but rather that Joe learned of the plot through some other means, such as via monitoring Tony's work phone, his emails, his texts, etc. And so Joe brings this matter to Edward, and essentially the board ends up divided over who should be the leader of Rogers Communications. And Edward ultimately moves to replace 5 independent directors who had attempted to oppose his plan. The whole thing lands in court, which is how we end up with Rogers v. Rogers, which is, of course, Edward Rogers versus Rogers Communications. And it becomes a fascinating legal and family drama from that point onward. And just to give you guys a little bit of a spoiler, the whole conflict is actually so intense that even the passing of the Rogers family matriarch, Loretta Ann Rogers, cannot reconcile this family.
Yeah, you know what? You're right. The word that you used is fascinating, and it is a fascinating story. And if you were to sit down and write this from scratch off the top of your head, I don't think you would be able to write a thriller like this if you were just sitting there with your coffee and writing. But, the one question I have, and I don't even know whether you have the answer to this, this whole dispute about who called whom. We can see that in statements, can't we?
There are a number of statements that have been made to court by both Joe Natale and by other members of the board that do say that the phone call did occur. Now, of course, Rogers is a telecom company, so they would have a paper trail of this. They can see whether or not the phone call took place and how long it occurred for. Joe has said it was a 21-minute call. I, as a reporter, don't have access to Rogers' backend systems, so I can't tell you whether the call logs validate that story or not.
So while all of this was taking place while Rogers was in the midst of trying to consummate its historic $20 billion takeover of Shaw, what was the significance of that deal?
Hugely significant deal. As I've mentioned, this was the deal of Ted's dreams. It would combine the East and West cable empires. So if you look at the history of Rogers and Shaw, which is kind of fascinating how similar the two histories are. You have a patriarch who's kind of building this empire from scratch. And at some point, Ted Rogers and J.R. Shaw, the founder of Shaw, they actually sit down on 2 occasions and they kind of come to an agreement that results in the country being carved up into East and West, with Rogers, of course, dominating in the East and Shaw dominating in the West. And so you have these East and West cable families, and this deal is essentially bringing them together under one roof. So it's a very, very historic moment for Rogers and Shaw, for the country, really, for the telecom industry. And the sticking point for the Competition Bureau becomes Shaw's wireless carrier, Freedom Mobile, which is, of course, Canada's fourth largest wireless carrier, is seen as this kind of scrappy player. And so there are these concerns that allowing Rogers to acquire Freedom would effectively eliminate a wireless carrier in a country that's already seen as being too concentrated in the hands of three telecoms.
Hold that thought. Don't go away. We'll be right back.